So today I'm here with John Bolton, who is the Director of Multifamily Development for the Better Housing Coalition. Hi, John.
Hello.
So thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, John. I wanted to ask you a series of questions about yourself and about your work with the Better Housing Coalition. So I will just dive right on in.
Sounds good.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the world of development?
Sure, absolutely. I went to Clemson Universities where I did both my undergrad and my master's. Now, talking about my undergrad, I was in aquaculture, fisheries, and wildlife biology, which has nothing to do with development at all.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It was a big jump. So, I graduated with that degree, and it was either, continue on with school, to either, stay in wildlife, become a biologist. But then I just decided to change tracks and actually went and looked in the graduate programs. And I was thinking at the time environmental planning, and then I got locked in with the local government, with the program. I did my master's in city and regional planning, and so through that, through the work I did through school, I started to get into local government planning and really enjoyed it from there. Graduated with my master's in '99. And went to, stayed in local government and pretty much worked in different localities in South Carolina. Ended up in Charleston and was down there for a few years working in some small towns and counties. And then got to a point where it was, you're always working with developers, you're always seeing, I know, we're going to talk about, later maybe some of the things that you see go wrong or go right. And you see enough of that and you're like, hey, I'd like to, maybe take a step into that world as well. So interviewed with a local real estate developer and got on board. And coincidentally, one of my first jobs with them was in Richmond. And so I was actually coming here long before I ever thought of living here with that job. And so stayed on with them until 2008. We all know 2008 was a really bad year for real estate. Got laid off pretty much, everybody in the commercial real estate in that company, they had to fold up. But they had an affordable housing arm, which I worked in a little bit while I was there. And so I started to get familiar with it. And one of my colleagues who had already moved to Richmond a year or two before, I got connected back up with him and he hired me to work with Community Housing Partners, which is a large, they're in the state, but they also work multi-state as well. And so that was when I really got into affordable housing with them. Stayed with them for a few years, and then I worked with Local Initiative Support Corporation, who's a community development leader based out of New York, but nationwide in about 30 offices. So for them, I worked as a lender. So I'd worked as a developer, really I'd worked in local government planning, then worked as a developer, then worked as a lender, and then finally now with Better Housing Coalition, back in the development world, so doing affordable housing.
So that's interesting. So how has the experience as a lender kind of impacted your work in the development space?
Quite a bit, and I would say, with LISC, they brought me closer to the community development side than anything I'd done before, working with a large, developer, you're pretty much arm's length from the actual, community side of it. It's all, just deal based at that point. But working with LISC, you're not only working on lending with deals, but you're actually working on community engagement, actually seeing, the grassroots portion of the development. And that's what I really loved about it, and it really kind of made a well-rounded approach. Coming back to Better Housing Coalition, doing real estate development, and just informed on the whole process that way.
So the firm that you were with, the first development company, what sort of real estate development did they do?
It was, at the time, it was a town center, commercial, mixed use, and back when that was, kind of the thing that a lot of folks are trying to do and doing, the town center approach to development. We've got a few of them here in Richmond. But the ones that I was working on, had commercial shopping centers, either condos or apartments, and it was all market rate. So there was no affordable in those developments at all.
So, given your role now with the Better Housing Coalition, what Can you just kind of describe what you do in that real estate development process?
Sure, sure. You know, the analogy is that, you know, you're like a conductor. You know, I think, you know, one of the things you sent me was the orchestrator and so you really are. You have a lot of different parts that you work with. You know, it can be from, you know, architects, engineers, lenders, legal, local government. The list goes on. And, you know, you're responsible for keeping everybody working towards the same goal of completing a development. You know, and for me, a Better Housing Coalition, it all starts with what is the vision, what's the mission of what we're delivering, and, you know, identifying what kind of projects we want to do, and then going out and finding either the land or the existing developments that fit that mold, and then applying our strategies and our, you know, network towards redeveloping or developing properties that fit what BHC wants to do. And so that's from acquiring the property to figuring out, you know, if it's a new construction, you know, what is the building going to look like, how are we going to build it, and working all the way through that pre-development, through construction, and then of course Better Housing Coalition has its own property management division, and that's about the time that I make the handoff. So all the way from conception to delivering to operation is the, you know, role that I play.
So you mentioned pre-development. Can you kind of describe what's involved in that? Because we know
Sure.
real estate development, but that pre-development piece is a little murky sometimes.
And it all starts again with, you know, what is the mission and the vision of who you're working for. You know, in this case, you know, we're delivering affordable housing. And so it's knowing what our parameters are and what we can, you know, live with and have with our development. And when you analyze a piece of property, let's say, you know, it's a land, you know, opportunity, and you're going to build from scratch. You have to know your local government and know what the zoning is, know what other rules are in place. You have to have an idea of, you know, how many apartment homes it'll take to actually make the deal work, what's the financing that you're going to go, you know, use on the property, and all those things start to, you know, create a, you know, a matrix and a patch quilt of what the deal is going to look like. So pre-development, you know, you may start engaging the architect to draw some designs for you, do what they call a yield analysis. How many units can you get on a property? And then you call an engineer in and you say, hey, let's check it out, make sure that we don't have bad soils, and you just start building your case. And I like to look at it from both ends of it. I'd like to try to find every way to make a deal work and try to find every way to not make it work. And so if you look at it from both ends, you can, you know, really start to, you know, check yourself with what you're doing. You may get too excited about a deal. You may think that this is the best thing ever, and you may forget about some of the other parts of it for trying to just push it through to make it happen. And vice versa. You may not like a deal, but there may be a lot of things that could make it work that you're overlooking.
I mean, that just seems, you know, really difficult to do because it seems like there are always going to be risks and rewards associated with projects. So is it kind of a pretty organic process, or is it kind of pretty scripted, some of the things that you're looking at and evaluating to make the decision around go or no go?
Right. Some of them are scripted. They carry over from each deal to the other. That's somewhere where you can get yourself in trouble too, is thinking because you did it before, it's going to be the same again. It might be a different local government that has different rules. You know, the program and the financing that you used last time may have different rules that you're going for. So, you know, looking at it each time as it's a fresh deal and asking questions like it's the first deal will keep you out of trouble, you know, with a lot of those instances on there.
Now, you talked a little bit, John, about the fact that there are a lot of different players involved. So how important is like relationship management and like just project management in the work that you're doing?
Right. It goes back to a lot of the ways of where, you know, for internally, for whoever you work for as a developer, understanding, you know, what's important to you. It's also keeping those relationships with folks outside, you know, be it the local government, be it a lender, and always, you know, just not meeting with them when there's a deal happening, but meeting with them to understand what's happening in their marketplace and in their industry, and what are the trends, what are the things that you see, And so in between deals, maintaining those relationships. And so once you do pull one deal together, you'll remember, what somebody told you, and you'll be able to apply it to that situation. So always, staying in communication with all the different partners that you have. And for us at Better Housing Coalition, that's also the actual community and the residents that live there. We dig a little deeper, I like to think, in terms of the engagement in a community when we do projects. And not only when we're doing a deal, but just in general, we're always engaged in the communities on some level in any different facet that we do, whether it be property management or resident services that we do. That's always important so that when we do go into a community, folks already know us, they know our message, they know what we do, and there's not a relearning process each time.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of community, can you explain a little bit what NIMBY is? Because we hear about that a lot of times when developers have to engage with communities, and those communities aren't necessarily all that receptive. So I'd like, just from your perspective, to kind of get a sense of what that is and how this impacts your development decision and your development process.
Yes. NIMBY, not in my backyard. So it's real. And it does affect our work a lot. And surprisingly, it does affect the market rate, apartment world as well. There's just, a lot of times when you have a property that, as we talked earlier, the development of property is changing it, from what it is currently. Folks are used to seeing what they see, somewhere for a long time. And the prospect of apartments, which is a lot more dense of a use, comes with a lot of questions, and knowing your message, knowing who you are, going into that and being able to convey that, to folks and understand what it is and what it isn't, is a big piece that, that's to say it's half the battle to get in there, but then it's delivering it, staying engaged. And anytime we go into a project and we know we're going into a community that may have a lot of questions, we have to consider the time. Time in real estate development can oftentimes be your enemy. Only accidentally often is it your friend. But generally, you need to be, you're against time for a variety of reasons, for the market, for competition, interest rates, things of that nature. So you always, and there's different for us at Better Housing Coalition, we apply for money that is on a time schedule more than anything else. So, a developer where they often may be able to go in and apply for a loan at any time, ours only comes sometimes once a year, maybe twice a year for the financing that we choose. So being able to map out the process that it's going to take and how intense it's going to be is a pretty important thing to be mindful of.
So do you always, because I'm just kind of thinking about the NIMBY phenomenon, but do you always have to engage with the community? Are there certain circumstances that require you get their input and then others that don't require that degree of engagement?
Right. If your property is already what they call entitled, and it already has the zoning that says that you can do everything that you want to do already, that's a time where you can make a decision. Do I go ahead and go forward with my deal? For Better Housing Coalition, we try not to do that. I think even in a case where we have entitlements by right zoning, we still like to engage the community because we stay on a property long term. We're not the typical market rate developer that may come in and build a property and then sell it in 5 to 7 years or so. We keep our properties long term, and so when we go into a community, we're also going to be an owner in that community for the long term. Mm-hmm. And so making that relationship early and that we know we're going to need to have is important on that.
Now, do you have any examples of having encountered NIMBYism in your work?
Absolutely, and I can turn to a recent example. We have a project in Union Hill called the Good One at Union Hill, and it was about a 4-year project from conception to actually start of construction. We had early on meetings, with the community, and for the most part at the time there was support, and there wasn't, it wasn't a lot of questions that made it seem like this was not the right thing to do, the way that it was initially planned. We worked our way through it, and got to a point where, we spoke to, local government, and we met with some of the local leaders out there. But then, as we were talking earlier with time, the longer it takes, then now there's more folks in the community, people that didn't play a part in the early process had different questions. And some of the folks had good questions. Some of the people did not want the development no matter what. Those are the ones where you try to compromise and you try to work with the folks that will go with you. This is an instance where we had by right zoning, but it needed architectural approval. So we could do everything we wanted to do by a zoning perspective. It just needed to look the right way to fit in with the community. And so the initial layout that we had did not quite fit what folks wanted, and so we had to parse out, the people that had genuine concerns and had comments on the way the development was, versus folks that we knew just did not like affordable housing. There was an element to that, to the process as well. So trying to walk that tightrope and make sure to be as respectful as we can within the community on that was important, and come out of that on the high road of that, because there were certainly some contentious times with that. NIMBY can be polite at first, but then it can really go in a bad direction sometimes.
So then how, in that particular circumstance, who was kind of driving the bus? Was it the community saying, this is what we kind of architecturally want it to look like, or was it the local government kind of dictating that, a little bit of both?
Sure, it's a good question. It's a little bit of both. So when we met early on with the city and the Commission of Architectural Review, we had some favorable feedback on the initial, layout that we had. And at a certain point, when other people got involved, that changed a little bit, and there was some new questions, some new feedback on it that we had to address. And in the end, I think it's a great development. We went from a larger, mass project to one that's now broken up and a little more in line with the rest of the community there. But it was a long process to get there, and so.
And so now, where is that project in, I guess, its life cycle?
It's just about complete. We should have the first few buildings available for occupancy in December is what we're hoping. This has been, I think they said it was the 8th wettest year on record, maybe the 5th by the end of this week. So it's been a tough year for construction across the board. So we were hoping to be done a little sooner than now, but in December and wrapping everything up by January, February next year.
So can you tell us a little bit about, because you talked a little about the process, but because there's so many different players involved, I can imagine that there are some log jams from time to time.
Yes.
Can you highlight what you think are some of the most significant hurdles or just issues that you face when you're trying to orchestrate all of this?
Definitely. And it can come in a couple of the different phases. We talked earlier about pre-development. Oftentimes that entitlement, the zoning, making sure you can fit what the city wants, and that can often be a logjam. And you can go into it knowing that that's going to be a process. And again, that's one where, you need to forecast, all right, this one may not be one we get done this year. This one may take a year or two for us to get it where it needs to be, not only to meet the city's, needs and wants on the zoning and other regulations, but what we can deliver as well for our future and potential tenants that will use the property. So that kind of, that's one that you can take extra time on. Financing, can also be another one. You may go in knowing that you're going to have to raise money, and sometimes you don't always hit the mark, and that may make a deal go a little bit longer. As we're seeing now, we mentioned earlier interest rates. If your deal takes too long, then what worked on paper a year ago may not look so good now. So does that mean we need to go find another source? Does that need we need to retool how many units we're doing, or or find some other ways to make the deal balance. Those are places that can be log jams. You can run against environmental. You can be going along just fine, and all of a sudden, you hit something. The Goodwin is a good example. It wasn't necessarily a roadblock, but it certainly cost a lot of money. We did soil testing, but what we didn't find were wells. And there were 2 wells on the property that just happened to be within a footprint of a building. And so we had to excavate, a lot more, earth than we originally planned to, and had to put some stronger material in there to hold it. So those little things can get in the way. A roadblock is not always time. It can also be money. And then oftentimes those two work together.
So in those cases, like you just mentioned, the environmental potential log jam, do you pretty much have to depend on the consultants or your partners to guide how you deal with those challenges when they come up, or do you just have a little bit of knowledge about everything?
It's a little bit of both. You do, from a legal standpoint, and just knowing the regulations and having, those things in place. Yes, you have to follow your consultants on what they do, but when they deliver this information to you, it may be something you've seen before. You know a way to work around a particular situation, and so as you grow as a developer and you do more deals, then you can know which questions to ask. Which parts of it are going to be important, which parts you can definitely say, all right, we can handle this.
So I've interviewed Andy Conlon, I know you know him, and Renee Shepperson.
Yes.
So you've talked a little bit about this, but how does or has your work intersected with their work?
Right. Andy, we recently worked with him. He represented us on the Goodwin project. So he's an attorney. Dealing in real estate law and does, things of that nature. So we pulled their firm in to help us, work through that final approval that we needed with the city. It just kind of gave a little distance. It let us be a little more engaged with the community and, let the attorney handle the face-to-face with the city on that end. And so it just kind of provided a little bit of blocker in between on that, and kept it a little more formal on that side, and allowed us to play out the process with the community there. That helped out quite a bit. So it just wasn't so emotional with the Commission of Architectural Review between an applicant. They were just state of the facts there, and we could work with the community straight.
And so in that case, John, was that just a game time decision that you made to pull Andy in, or I guess was that decision made early on in the process?
It was game time. It was mid-game, about halftime. We had to change the play up a little bit, and so what we were doing wasn't quite working. The message wasn't being delivered in the right way. And we thought that would be the most effective way to do it. We were trying to balance both the community and the city at the same time, and that just made it a little more murky. So we brought somebody in that was a professional in doing that, and it helped out quite a bit.
So it's like you're just constantly making decisions or having to evaluate the decisions that you make, given where things are in the development process. So it just seems like you're just always just pivoting or just trying to anticipate. So is that exhilarating? It seems a little nerve-wracking to me.
It's nerve-wracking. I mean, there's a dichotomy, and oftentimes multiple decisions with every decision you make. I can, red pill, blue pill on just about everything that you're doing. And so, yes, it's nerve-wracking, but that's the fun of it that I enjoy, and that's, alluded to it a little earlier. Taking every deal, not like it's exactly your first deal, but don't take everything that, hey, I've done this before, I know how this works, because things change. Things change within a year, things change within months of how, all those external partners operate. And if you think you got it right one time, that may not be the way it works the next time. And it all started, I remember back when my master's, one of my real estate development professors, my favorite one he always said was, know your state enabling legislation. He was talking about it in the context of planning, but know your boundaries, know where you are at all times. And so if you take those things for granted, they will change on you.
So if I guess, kind of considering that on the financing side. So with Renee Shepperson, how has your role or your work intersected with her?
Sure.
And what does that really look like?
Absolutely, and of course, Renee, being a banker, my first work with her at Better Housing Coalition was on a loan for a property that had been operating for almost 18 years, and it was time to refresh. It needed a little bit of rehab, but it also just needed a refinance as well. So worked closely with Renee and finding out which products she had that would work best with that. We had already talked about using maybe some federally funded projects, even looked at it as a tax credit affordable. So we looked at it all the complicated ways. And then finally we went to Renee and said, Renee, show us the not the easy way, but show us the most efficient way to get this done. And she helped us walk through how we could still, do some upgrades and things that are not just, doing little details and to the project. It's actually replacing hot water heaters, replacing hot, HVAC, and doing things some things are going to make it more sustainable, but also reposition our financing on the project so that from a cash flow perspective and an operational perspective, it's going to be better for the long term. So Renee was really instrumental in helping us get to that point, and still is.
And so that when you work in partnership with bankers or lenders, are you having to come to them with like fully baked proposals? And just can you kind of walk through what that process looks like?
Sure. You have to come with a model that shows your primary way that you want it to work. But oftentimes when I go to a lender, I want to show plan A, and then I want to show B and C as well. So if it doesn't work this way, I've got two other ways that it can work, or that I think it can work, and then start the conversation from there. Generally they want to see that you've already initially run your numbers. You may not know all their financing available at that time, and that way they can see where you're coming from, and they say, hey, well, I've got a little bit different way of looking at it, and they can help you work your way through in case you had a gap in your financing, or maybe you were assuming something wrong, assuming something that you did on another deal that would work in this case, but it doesn't. Coming to a lender, you don't have to have it all baked, but you do have to have it, at least all the ingredients on the table. So.
Now, so the Better Housing Coalition has a track record in the development space. Is that the reason why it hasn't been really difficult for you to identify funding partners? I guess, does your credibility and track record as a developer make a difference for a lender? How do they evaluate that?
Yeah, they certainly look at the track record of the company that you're bringing forward on the project. They do look at your development team. Often early on when you're presenting the information, how much of a deep dive is this going to be into working with this partner. But yeah, I think having a seasoned developer like Better Housing Coalition has been around almost 30 years now. Certainly does carry a lot into that. But along with that, they're still going to look at your financials. They're going to look back, how you've been doing for the past 1, 2, 3 years. Are you sustainable? And can you, afford to take a hit should this loan not go as well as you think it will? If the property doesn't operate, do you have the ability to support those bad years or things that don't go right?
Mm-hmm. So you can talk about this from personal experience or just generally. Can you describe like the biggest mistake a developer makes or that you feel like you've made in kind of planning for a project?
Yeah, I think, in general, and I make them all the time. You mentioned it earlier, you're looking at so many things, and you're having to choose which ones get attention and which ones don't. Because a deal, while it does have its own kinetic energy and will keep moving along, if you're not touching each part of it at a certain point and pushing it forward, and not only just keeping the architect on path and keeping the engineer on path, but the interrelated pieces of them and keeping an eye on that, that's where things can go wrong, because we assume that everybody is an expert in their own field out here. It doesn't mean they're an expert in another. And while being a developer, you're kind of the jack of all trades, master of none, sort of situation. You do have to know how they interplay. And so, the things where you can trip up, is number one, thinking that each one of those divisions knows what's going on with the other. The old trust but verify. If you tell me that this is the way it's supposed to be, let me just dig in a little bit, just make sure on that. And then, what we talked about earlier, thinking that because it worked one time, it's going to work another, and that things haven't changed. So I see oftentimes, and when I was in local government, I would see that all the time, where a developer would come in and they've spent months, oftentimes maybe over a year working on a deal, and they bring that to you and it can't work. And there's like a fatal flaw in it where just one phone call to the local government would have said, hey, it can't work that way, but let me show you another way that it can work. But you spend a lot of money and a lot of time for something that's not going to work. Early on, that was some of the things that I learned from a local government perspective of what to watch out for. So, but we still make them. I mean, there's just so many things going on, and you have to choose which ones get attention at what time, and things will slip.
So I guess if you had to choose, I guess what phase would you say is the most risky phase? Pre-development, development, construction, operations? What would you say?
I would say design development is the most risky phase. At that point, if things aren't coordinated, they will fall apart later. So, if and even in between the different, like say with an architect, if they don't have something coordinated with the mechanical and engineering and plumbing, that's going to translate out in the field later when somebody's looking at the plans and it doesn't work. It may have gone through the city, it may have gotten a building permit, and just because this is the trust but verify, just because it goes through those doesn't mean it's going to work. And so that is, to me, the most critical phase of when you're doing design development, both with your construction drawings and also just your site plans and laying it out. That's where it'll come out. It won't come out then, but it'll come out later.
And so, you just maybe think about like the design phase. So, are there different professionals who have specialties in like kind of the architectural design? You mentioned mechanical, electrical. So how does all of that kind of come together? Are you coordinating all of these different design professionals, or is there somebody else who's kind of responsible for making sure all these pieces, the site plan and all of those pieces are coming together?
Right. Generally in between each, let's say like architecture, there's going to be, you may have used them for some initial, land planning, but there would be a component in there. There's a component that does the initial elevations and concepts, and then you go into construction drawings, and then you got landscape architecture. And so within that umbrella, there's a central person that you will work with, but all those trades are working in the background. And they consult with mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineers, to put all their plans together. And, with your engineering firm on the site, you may have a main contact there, but behind the works on that, you've got civil. Sometimes they'll do landscape as well, but there will be, water and sewer, stormwater, a whole bunch of different trades all within their survey that play a role. And they're happening, and that's part of the checks that you run. Generally, you have one contact, but yeah, there's a lot of layers underneath going on in each one of those.
Now, I'll just kind of get to like the fun part too. Sure. Can you tell us a little bit about the coolest projects that you either are working on or have worked on?
Yeah. And I gave this one some thought. But it actually didn't take a lot of time. I think one of the cool examples of a project I've worked on was the Petersburg Library, and for a variety of reasons on that one. It was the first project I did when I went to LISC. And we utilized a financing tool called New Market Tax Credits. And it was my first time using those, and really it's been the only time that I've actually, closed on a deal that had new markets involved. But the best part of that project, because before I'd worked for a for-profit developer, I worked for a larger nonprofit, and so never really dove in, to the community end of it as much before. And with this one, this library that they were in Petersburg up until then was built in 1859. Wow. Old. The Wayne Crocker, the director of the library system, sweetest man, been there forever, loved the library system, had been working really hard for decades really talking about doing this in terms of getting a new library. And then finally a foundation was started. And through about a 10-year process with that foundation, they got to the point where they could finance the library. The New Markets piece that LISC participated in was kind of the last money in. A lot of other pieces had come together. And so, I came in towards the end of the process, but seeing, how, just the lending in, of community development could transform and transform lives was just really great, to get it on the ground level there and experience that. And it just happened at the time my wife was working for a company that had a grant for computers, and so they gave a grant on the computer lab. So we actually got to work a little bit together on the project. Because they went from 14 computers to over 60 in the city, library system. And one of the cool things, they had 1,800 or so, library cards that were, out. In the first week of the library, they had over 7,000 library cards. And it was more than just a library. They had health and wellness programs, small business, and helping folks with education, adult education. And so it just really became a community center, and it opened my eyes up to, the things that I could get involved in, and, some of the same themes I still carry today with affordable housing.
So in that project in particular, John, was who acted as the developer?
Right. It was more or less kind of a, between, the foundation. There was a foundation that got started that had some real estate development experience in there. And then, really, Wayne Crocker, I called him the tip of the spear. He was, the one that, really drove that process. But they had some developers that, also helped on that end as well, both financially and with their expertise, came in on that. So it was really a good community level collaboration, that didn't involve just the highest level of money and expertise, but all the way down to the community and their input. It was a great, great project to be a part of.
Wow.
I just slipped in at the end, to help pull together the last part of the financing, but watching it all come together was really special.
And so, since you were the lender on that project, what was it that, because I'm thinking about it's a library, it's not really income producing. So how do you get comfortable supporting like a really good community project like that may not be able to, I guess, generate capital in order to pay a loan?
Right, and really, in this case, it wasn't necessarily a loan per se. There was a small loan that went to it that wasn't that hard to underwrite. Okay. They used revenue bonds through the city that paid for a good portion of it. But the new market tax credit goes in as equity that never has to be repaid, which was the great thing about that. And so, usually when you use something like New Markets, they call it the but-for test. And so they want to see that you've done everything and the project can work but for that last bit of financing that goes in. And so, so that's how the New Markets came in and played a role.
Okay. So now it looks like in Richmond, the city, or I guess the region, has gotten really popular because I've seen a lot of developers from outside of the region coming in. So I'm just kind of curious about like your thoughts. I mean, nonprofit developers, private developers, what is it about Richmond that's attracting developers and capital from all across the nation?
Right.
And then I guess what are the implications of that?
I think it's two things. You see a lot of trading going on, which, in my estimation, is not necessarily development per se. A lot of properties are trading for a good, amount of money without much work going into it. So the development side of the equation is non-existent. It's just money trading hands right now, and so they're doing a little bit of work, what they call value add, which essentially gets the value back up. So when they trade it again, they can make their money. So, but we are seeing a lot of actual true developers come into town, and it's just a really strong market. Richmond's diversifying at a great rate. I came in here in 2009. And you can't imagine what would be here today in terms of the just the diverse culture that has grown in that time. So it's just kind of a hot, cool area. A place like a Scottish Edition. If somebody told you they saw that 10 years ago, there's a few that did and got in early, but most folks have jumped on now, and so it's things like that folks from the outside see. So there's opportunities for development and there's opportunities for investment. Both of them are necessary and needed in some cases. You have to drive up the value to make things worth coming into. But for our end, that makes the work a little more difficult. We, of course, with affordable housing, we base our projects on the ability, to provide lower rents to modest means, households of modest means. And so to do that, we can't afford as much debt, and we have to raise a lot more money. And so that when that acquisition number and the development budget goes up, it makes it that much harder to do our work.
So thank you, John,
All
for
right.
sharing your insight and knowledge about development. I appreciate you making the time. And that concludes this session or podcast on real estate development.